Chapter 15. What is Freedom? Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. Part 1. The Meaning of Freedom. After the Civil War, freed slaves and white allies in the North and South attempted to redefine the meaning and boundaries of American freedom. Freedom, once for whites only, now incorporated black Americans. By rewriting laws, African Americans, for the first time, would be recognized as citizens with equal rights and the right to vote, even in the South. Blacks created their own schools, churches, and other institutions. Though many of Reconstruction's achievements were short-lived and defeated by violence and opposition, Reconstruction laid the basis for future freedom struggles. The destruction of slavery made freedom and its definition central to national life. Was freedom for former slaves to be simply negative, the absence of slavery? Or was freedom also positive, including rights to civil equality, the vote, or land ownership? Freedom was contested and contradictory in the era of Reconstruction. African Americans' sense of freedom was rooted in their experience of slavery and knowledge of free society. Freedom, above all, meant escaping the horrors and injustices of slavery and enjoying the rights and opportunities of American citizenship. Freed blacks celebrated their new space to do what was denied under slavery, hold meetings and religious services free of white supervision, own dogs, guns, and liquor, and move freely to find work and family members. Many moved to southern cities, which seemed liberating compared to the rural plantation areas. Black institutions established under slavery, such as the Family and Secret Slave Church and free black churches and schools, were strengthened and expanded after the war. The family was fundamental to post-war black life. Former slaves sought to find loved ones separated from them by sale, and widows of black soldiers won the fight to gain pensions from the federal government, which acknowledged the status of slave marriages. Reconstruction also transformed relationships within families as black men and women sought to inhabit the separate spheres of free families, with women spending more time with families at home and men engaging in most work outside the home. Yet poverty compelled many black women to find wage work. After the war, most blacks also left white churches and established their own churches. Independent black churches, most notably Methodists and Baptists, grew rapidly, and the church became central to black life, providing an educational, social, and political space for the black community. Freed people actively sought to improve themselves through education, which they hoped would allow them to read the Bible, prosper, and participate in politics, and the first black colleges were founded at this time. Inevitably, in a society in which political participation was central to freedom, former slaves wanted the right to vote. Once the war ended, and even earlier in some parts of the South, freed blacks and former slaves asserted themselves in the public sphere, meeting, petitioning, and demanding the right to vote and organize their own political groups and candidates. Blacks now celebrated the 4th of July, a holiday that many white Southerners soon came to shun. Land ownership was at the core of the former slaves' sense of freedom. By acquiring land, the freed slaves hoped to create an economic life and communities beyond white control and interference. Many former slaves believed that they had earned rights to the land through their unpaid labor, while freed people's idea of freedom was similar to that of white Americans, including self-ownership, family stability, religious liberty, political participation, and economic independence. They saw freedom as an open-ended process of transformation, not a birthright that could be assumed. Most Southern whites were dismayed by defeat and emancipation, which caused enormous destruction and resulted in Northern domination. Some 260,000 Southern men died in the war, more than a fifth of the South's adult male whites, and the war destroyed much of the agricultural property on which the Southern economy was based. Plantation-owning families faced enormous changes, having lost their slaves and their life savings, which had been invested in Confederate government bonds. With their slaves gone, some had to engage in physical labor for the first time in their lives. Southern planters tried to impose their own vision of freedom on the former slaves, seeking to regain the old control that they had exercised under slavery. Freedom from planters still meant hierarchy and mastery. It was a privilege, not a right, and did not mean economic independence or civil and political equality. Northerners immediately tried to impose their own vision of freedom as free labor. Blacks would become wage workers and landowners, just like free whites in the North, and Northern investors would inject capital and migrants into the South and rebuild the economy. The South would eventually resemble the free society of the North. Conflict was inevitable. Planters wanted a labor system as close to slavery as possible. Former slaves wanted economic autonomy and access to land. Directed by O. Howard, a Maine abolitionist and Civil War general, the Freedmen's Bureau was established by Congress in March 1865 to establish a functioning free labor system in the South. The Bureau's agents were tasked to establish schools, give aid to the poor and aged, solve disputes between whites and blacks, and ensure equal treatment for former slaves and white unionists in the courts. Though the Bureau, which existed from 1865 to 1870, had no more than 1,000 agents at its height, it accomplished much in education and healthcare. But the Bureau had conflicted legacy in economic affairs. The Bureau believed that sound race relations in the South would rest on fair wages and working conditions and on opportunities for improvement and social advance. But freed people wanted land, not wage work on plantations. The law founding the Bureau enabled the agency to divide abandoned and confiscated land into 40-acre plots for rental and sale to the freed people. But in summer 1865, President Andrew Johnson ordered that almost all confiscated land in federal hands be returned to former owners. In South Carolina and Georgia, Army troops forcibly evicted blacks who had been given land by General Sherman, who had promised 40 acres and a mule to the families of former slaves. Although blacks protested, no land distribution occurred, and nearly all rural freed people stayed poor and propertyless during Reconstruction. They had little choice but to return to work on the plantations, often for former owners. Black men were mostly confined to farm work, unskilled labor, and service jobs. Black women were restricted to domestic work as cooks and maids. Wages were too low to build savings or wealth, although by 1900 a significant number of Southern blacks had acquired land their own. A new labor system emerged in the South. The task system survived in the rice areas of South Carolina and Georgia, while supervised wage labor became the norm in the Cotton Belt and much of the tobacco areas of Virginia and North Carolina. Sharecropping developed first as a compromise between black desires for land and planters' insistence on labor discipline. It allowed each black family to rent a part of a plantation, and the crop was divided between the worker and the owner at the end of the year. Sharecropping gave planters a stable labor force, and former slaves preferred it to gang labor because it freed them from white supervision. But sharecropping became increasingly oppressive over time, especially as declining prices for southern crops limited opportunities for sharecroppers. The war and its aftermath also greatly impacted white farmers who experienced what they thought was a loss of freedom. Before the war, most small white farmers had raised food for their families and grew little cotton. The war and successive crop failures ruined many farmers. To get supplies from merchants, they were forced to grow cotton and commit part of the crop as collateral, or property that the creditor could seize if a debt was not paid, which became known as the Crop Lien. Though the rural South's economy suffered, southern cities saw considerable growth in the post-war period. New railroad lines allowed city merchants to engage in commerce with the North, and a new urban middle class of merchants, railroad entrepreneurs, and bankers benefited from the expansion of cotton production. Reconstruction transformed the lives of all Southerners. The antebellum world of master-slave and independent yeoman had been replaced by a post-war world with the new social classes. Landowning employers, black and white sharecroppers, white cotton farmers, black wage workers, and urban businessmen. The debates over land, labor, and political power that defined Reconstruction in America had parallels in other societies that experienced emancipation. In each case, planters tried to make former slaves return to plantation work to grow the same crops as under slavery and considered free black workers as lazy and devoid of ambition. Slaves sought independence through owning land to avoid labor similar to that of slavery, or others through strategies to escape white control. Planters attempted to replace freedmen with a new foreign source of labor. In the British case in the Caribbean, this was Indians, and in the American case, the Chinese. But the United States was unique as a post-slavery society in that it gave freedmen the right to vote, an event that emerged as a result of the struggle between Congress and President Andrew Johnson over the course of Reconstruction.